You're listening to Blueprint and Soul, a podcast about building from the inside out. I'm your host, Sal Carter. This is a space for reflection, honesty, and intentional growth. Today's episode is about presence, not withdrawal, not overfunctioning, but learning to move differently once awareness enters the room. Over the last few episodes, we've been naming patterns, gathering language, making sense of what we survived. Today, we're exploring what it means to live with that awareness, without losing yourself and without disappearing from the spaces that matter. So let's get into it. Awareness changes things. Once you start noticing patterns, how you overfunction, how you brace, how you prepare for impact before it arrives, you can't unsee them. But awareness doesn't remove responsibility. It doesn't give you permission to disappear. It doesn't excuse you from the rooms you've committed to. It doesn't mean you stop showing up for the work, the people, or yourself. This is where things get complicated. Because after survival, many people swing hard towards withdrawal. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because they're tired and they're trying not to get hurt again. So the instinct becomes, if I see the pattern, I can avoid the pain. But avoiding isn't the same as choosing. And here's the truth that doesn't always feel good to say out loud. Even after the work, even after the insight, even after the healing, you still have to show up. The difference is how you show up. Survival taught us to arrive armored. Discernment teaches us to arrive present. Showing up doesn't mean proving. It doesn't mean carrying everything. And see, this is the important part. It doesn't mean pretending the risk is gone. It means you stop letting fear decide for you. Because disappearing isn't rest, and isolation isn't peace. The real work isn't stepping back forever. It's learning how to stay engaged without self-abandonment. Awareness doesn't cancel obligation. That's one of the hardest truths to sit with. Because after you name a pattern, a survival response, a reflex to prove, a habit of overextending, there's often an unspoken hope that something will lift, that the pressure will ease, that you'll suddenly be free to move differently. But most of the time, that's not how it works. The meeting is still on the calendar. The responsibility still exists. The people in your life still expect you to show up. And awareness doesn't remove that. What it removes is automaticity. Before awareness, you showed up on instinct. You did what you always did. You gave what you always gave. After awareness, there's a pause. And in that pause, a new tension appears. Because now you're choosing. You're deciding how much of yourself to bring, how fast to move, how available to be. And choice takes energy. Sometimes more energy than survival ever did. This is the part people don't talk about. Growth isn't just emotional, it's logistical. It shows up in real time, in emails, in conversations, in rooms where you don't feel like explaining your evolution. You still have to show up, but the question quietly changes. Not will I show up, but how do I show up without betraying what I now know? That's the work of this chapter. Not opting out, not burning it all down, but learning how to stay present without disappearing inside of what's expected of you. And that requires something survival never asked for: discernment. Let's talk about that. One of the quiet mistakes we make after survival is confusing discernment with distance. We tell ourselves, if I pull back, I'm protecting my peace. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes what we're calling peace is really exhaustion trying to feel safe. Discernment doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to decide. Withdrawal is reactive. Discernment is responsive. Withdrawal says, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Discernment says, I'm still here, but I'm choosing how I engage. This matters because disengaging completely can feel empowering at first, especially if you spend years being over-available, over-explaining, or over-performing. But long-term, withdrawal narrows your life. It shrinks possibility, it limits connection, and it quietly teaches your nervous system that the only way to stay safe is to stay away. Discernment does the opposite. It keeps you in the room without demanding that you carry the whole room. It allows you to participate without being consumed, to contribute without being depleted. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, how do I avoid this entirely? Discernment asks, what is mine to handle here and what isn't? That question creates space, not distance, space. And space is where choice lives. There's a quiet tension many of us live inside of. On one side, the desire to stay engaged, use our voice, offer our skill, be present in the rooms we worked hard to enter. On the other, the exhaustion that comes from having learned to show up as shrinking, smoothing, or overmanaging ourselves. So the question isn't whether you show up, it's how. Because showing up doesn't have to mean absorbing everything. It doesn't have to mean anticipating every reaction. And it doesn't have to mean making yourself smaller so others stay comfortable. This is where presence becomes practice, not performance. Presence says, I'm here, I'm aware, and I'm not disappearing just to make this easier. For many of us, self-erasure didn't begin as an insecurity. It began as adaptation. Reading the room, adjusting tone, managing perception. Those skills kept doors open. They kept friction low. They helped us survive. But survival strategies don't always age well. What once kept us safe can quietly start to cost us clarity, energy, and authenticity. And the cost that shows up subtly. You leave conversations tired without knowing why. You replay moments that didn't need replaying. You feel present everywhere, except inside yourself. This is a pivot point. Showing up without self-erasure doesn't mean dropping awareness. It means reclaiming authorship. You still listen, but you stop over-translating. You still contribute, but you stop pre-editing yourself to avoid imagined outcomes. You still care, but you stop carrying what was never handed to you. Presence at this level is not loud. It's anchored. It looks like letting a pause exist without rushing to fill it. It looks like stating your point without cushioning it for comfort. It looks like leaving a room with the same amount of energy you brought into it. And this matters, not just for your work, but for your nervous system. Because when you stop erasing yourself to stay engaged, your body learns something new. That showing up doesn't always require bracing. That realization doesn't change the world overnight, but it changes how you meet it. And that shift from endurance to presence creates the conditions for what comes next. There is a cost to presence. Not the kind we're warned about, not the dramatic kind, the quieter one. When you stop erasing yourself, friction becomes more visible. Not because you've changed, but because you're no longer buffering the room from who you actually are. Presence can disrupt patterns. People who are comfortable with your availability may feel unsettled by your boundaries. People who benefited from your overfunctioning may interpret your recalibration as a distance. This is often where doubt creeps in. You wonder if you're doing something wrong, if you're becoming harder, if you're losing connection. But discomfort isn't always damage. Sometimes it's information. Presence reveals where relationships were built on accommodation instead of mutuality. where contribution quietly becomes expectation, where being easy to work with meant being endlessly flexible. That awareness can feel lonely because you're no longer invisible, but you're also no longer overextending just to stay connected. This is the cost most people don't name. Growth can change proximity, not because you care less, but because you're caring without self-erasure. Presence asks a hard question. Which relationships adjust when you stop disappearing, and which ones don't? That answer isn't something to rush. It's something to observe with compassion. Before we move on, I want to pause here for a moment, because what we're talking about isn't just something happening in isolation. These questions about presence, boundaries, and staying connected without disappearing are showing up for a lot of people. This is from the community. Over the past few weeks, I've heard from listeners who are asking versions of the same question. How do I stay engaged without losing myself? People who are dependable, thoughtful, deeply invested, and quietly wondering when being the strong one started costing so much. If that question feels familiar, I want you to know there's nothing wrong with you. You're noticing something real. And noticing is the beginning of recalibration. Before we move forward, I want to shift us from reflection into navigation. Not to rush past what you're noticing, but to give it somewhere to land. These are today's blueprint tips. Blueprint tip number 1. Let friction be informative, not directive. Not all discomfort means you're wrong. Sometimes it's the signal that you're no longer compensating. What this can look like: pausing before fixing tension that isn't yours to resolve. Blueprint tip number 2. Distinguishing connection from accommodation. Connection allows difference. Accommodation erases it. What this can look like: staying engaged in conversations without reshaping yourself for approval. Blueprint tip number 3. Presence is an ongoing practice. You don't arrive at it once. You return to it. What this can look like: checking in with your body after interactions, noticing whether you feel grounded or depleted. Before we close, I want to take a moment to slow things down, because everything we talked about today lives in the mind, but lands in the body. This is today's Soul segment. If this episode brought something up for you, that makes sense. We talked about presence, and presence asks more of us than performance ever did. So wherever you are right now, let your shoulders drop. Not helpfully, not intentionally, just let them drop. Take a breath that isn't preparing for anything. You don't need to solve what you noticed today. You don't need to decide what it means yet. Awareness doesn't ask for action. It asks for honesty. If staying present has created friction in your life, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It may simply mean you're no longer disappearing to keep things smooth. And if that feels uncomfortable, let that be okay. Growth doesn't always feel affirming. Sometimes it just feels real. As you move into the rest of your week, hold this question gently. Where am I still shrinking to stay connected? And what would it feel like to stay present instead? You don't have to answer it. Just notice where it shows up. If this episode helped you name something or gave you language for an experience you've been living, let that be enough for today. You don't need to rush it. And if you want to keep the conversation going, you're always welcome to reach out. You can send reflections or questions to blueprintandsoulpod@gmail.com or connect with us on Instagram @blueprintandsoul. Thank you for trusting this space. Thank you for showing up. Not perfectly, but honestly. Until next time, build with intention and lead with soul.